For 6 weeks, you've been standing at the same fork. You know both paths. You've thought about them until the thinking stopped meaning anything, and each time you got close to choosing, something pulled you back to the middle. Today, the mechanism that kept pulling you back makes its final pass. Since February 12th, Mercury has crossed the North Node at 8 degrees Pisces 3 times, first direct, then retrograde on March 17th at the peak of the loop, and today, March 23rd, for the third and final time, now moving forward. 3 passes to the same degree over 6 weeks is not a pattern that repeats. It's a cycle that completes. The North Node marks a direction, the one you've been circling without committing. Today, Mercury lands on it for the last time. This is what closes today. The equal weight between 2 versions of your life. Not the choice itself, but the condition that kept both options suspended at the same level. The crossroads doesn't disappear. One side of it becomes heavier than the other. What's unexpected is how this closing works. The shift doesn't come from a new insight. It comes from exhaustion of the return mechanism. The thing that kept pulling you back stops having the structure to do so. In the next few minutes, you'll discover 3 things. First, why Mercury crossing the North Node 3 times created a specific 6-week crossroads pattern, and what the third pass structurally closes. Second, why today is the last moment this particular fork has equal weight on both sides. Third, what the next 48 hours reveal about which version of your life is already moving, before you've formally decided anything. 6 weeks of equal weight between 2 options had a structure. That structure completes today. What has felt like an open question does not stay equally open after its own cycle ends. Think about what those 6 weeks actually felt like from the inside. Not the content of the decision, the motion. You'd get close. Something in you would begin to lean one direction. And then, before that lean could become weight, before it could become commitment, something would level it back out. Both options would return to the same height, and you'd find yourself, again, in the middle. It wasn't confusion. You understood the choice clearly. It wasn't fear of getting it wrong. You've made hard decisions before. It was the leveling, the return to center, every time. That motion ran from February 12th until this morning. Not approximately, exactly. There is a date where the cycle began, a date where it peaked, and a date where it completed. The cycle has a structure as specific as a calendar event, because that's what it is. You are watching this after the final pass has already occurred. The mechanism made its last move this morning. What you're doing right now is not waiting for something to happen. You're understanding what already happened and what it means for the next 48 hours. To understand that, you need to see how this cycle was built, what created the return mechanism in the first place, and why 3 passes to 1 degree over 6 weeks is a complete event rather than an interrupted one. The North Node is a directional point, not a planet. It has no mass, no orbit you can photograph. It's a calculated position, the place where the moon's path crosses the sun's path as it moves northward. In astrology, it marks the direction of forward movement, the pull toward what's next rather than what's familiar. Its opposite point, the South Node, marks the direction of return, the path back to what's already known, already resolved, already lived. When Mercury crosses the North Node, it activates a specific question. Where are you moving forward, and where are you falling back on what you already know? That question doesn't surface as a thought you can write down. It surfaces as pressure, the internal weight of a direction that hasn't been committed to yet. Mercury first crossed the North Node at 8 degrees Pisces on February 12th. That's the date the crossroads became fully visible. Not the first time you'd thought about the choice, but the first time it had this specific quality of weight, of 2 paths feeling equally possible and equally real. Mercury in direct motion raised the question cleanly. Both options were present, both had ground under them. The question was open. 6 days later, on February 20th, Saturn and Neptune met at exact conjunction at 0 degrees Aries. That conjunction matters here because of what Saturn does. It provides structural support, the scaffolding that holds a decision in place long enough to act on it. Neptune dissolves form at the edges. When those two planets met exactly at 0 degrees, Aries, the first degree of new cycles, the entry point where a new direction needs ground most, the result was specific, not general fog. The removal of structural support at the precise point where the decision needed to stand. Then, on February 26th, Mercury went retrograde, and it went retrograde in Pisces. Pisces is the part of the zodiac where edges between things become porous. Mercury retrograde in Pisces doesn't slow down thinking in the ordinary sense. It removes the line between "I've already decided" and "I still don't know." You can reach a conclusion and not be able to feel it as a conclusion. Every near arrival dissolves back into question, not because you changed your mind, because the ground under the landing disappeared at the moment of contact. Now, both mechanisms were running simultaneously. Saturn-Neptune had removed structural support at the entry point of new direction. Mercury retrograde in Pisces was resetting every approach back to open question. One took the floor away, the other returned you to the threshold each time you found the edge of it. On March 17th, Mercury, still retrograde, crossed back through the North Node for the second time. This is the peak of the cycle, and it behaves differently from the first pass. Mercury retrograde returning to the North Node doesn't open the question again. It confirms it's still unresolved. The same crossroads, the same weight, the same two options at the same height. But now with 6 weeks of accumulated pressure behind it. That's why mid-March felt heavier than February did. The question hadn't changed. The weight of not answering it had. Mercury stationed direct on March 20th. The retrograde ended, but the cycle itself didn't close there. The third pass, Mercury moving forward through the North Node again, is a different event from Mercury simply going direct. It's the completion of the full 3-part sequence: opening, return, closure. And that third pass happened this morning. What makes it a closure rather than another repetition is what's changed between the first pass and this one, and why the return mechanism no longer has the structure to make a fourth pass. The first two passes and the third one look identical from the outside. Mercury at 8 degrees Pisces crossing the North Node, same degree, same point. But the internal conditions are completely different, and that difference is what makes this morning a closure rather than a continuation. When Mercury crossed the North Node on February 12th, it was moving forward through territory it hadn't yet covered. The retrograde hadn't happened. The full Pisces sequence from 22 degrees back down to 8 degrees and forward again hadn't run. Mercury raised the question of direction at the North Node, then continued onward, then stopped, reversed, and traveled back through every degree between 22 degrees and 8 degrees Pisces across the following weeks. That backward passage is not wasted motion. Mercury retrograde in Pisces, moving through those degrees, was processing the material between those 2 points. Every unresolved element, every unarticulated pull, everything that lived in the space between "I know which direction" and "I can't commit to it yet." By the time Mercury reached the North Node again on March 17th going backward, the second pass confirmed the cycle wasn't complete. The material hadn't finished. Then, Mercury stationed direct and began moving forward again. This morning, it arrived back at 8 degrees Pisces, the same degree, the same node, but now having completed the full arc. Everything between 8 degrees and 22 degrees Pisces has been covered 3 times. There is no unprocessed material left in that range. Mercury returns to the North Node this time without residue. That's the structural difference, and it produces a specific result. The return mechanism, the thing that leveled both options back to equal weight each time you approached a decision, required an incomplete cycle to sustain itself. The incompleteness was the mechanism. Each time you got close to committing to one direction, the unfinished arc of Mercury's retrograde was still available as a pullback toward open question. There was always another pass coming. The cycle wasn't done, so the question couldn't settle. This morning, there is no next pass. The cycle is complete. The incompleteness that sustained the return mechanism is gone. What replaces it is not clarity. The hook is precise about this. The crossroads doesn't disappear. Both paths are still there. What changes is the weight distribution between them. One side becomes heavier, not because a decision was made, but because the structural support for keeping both options at exactly equal weight no longer exists. There's one additional detail about this morning that most readings on this transit skip. As Mercury made its third pass through the North Node, the Moon formed a brief sextile, a supportive angle, to Saturn, Neptune, and the Sun in sequence between approximately 7 and 11 a.m. Eastern Time. A sextile doesn't force anything. It opens a short window where the emotional state and the structural event are aligned rather than in friction. The closing of the cycle and the internal state of the person experiencing it were briefly running in the same direction. That window is already behind you. But what it means is that the closing this morning didn't happen against resistance. It had a brief period of internal support. The cycle closed in the most complete conditions available. But there is one thing that needs to be separated clearly before the next 48 hours make sense, and people almost always conflate these two things in the hours after a cycle like this completes. The two things people conflate in this moment are the cycle closing and the decision arriving. They feel like they should be the same event, 6 weeks of equal weight between two options, a mechanism that kept returning you to the middle, and now the mechanism is done. It seems like the natural result is that the answer appears, that you'll feel, clearly and finally, which path is the right one. That's not what closes today. And if you expect it, the next few hours will feel like a disappointment that isn't actually a disappointment. Here is the precise state you're in right now. The return mechanism is gone. The structural support for keeping both options at exactly equal weight has been removed. What you're left with is not clarity, it's asymmetry. One option is beginning to feel heavier than the other, not decisively, not with the clean certainty of a choice made, just heavier, like one side of a scale that's begun to tilt without anyone adding weight to it. That tilt is the result of the cycle completing. It is not the result of a decision. The distinction matters because asymmetry and clarity are not the same thing, and confusing them leads to one of two mistakes. The first, waiting for clarity before acting because the tilt doesn't feel definitive enough. The second, forcing a final decision right now because the mechanism is closed and something feels different, and you want to resolve it while the feeling is present. Neither of those is what this window supports. The hook names this precisely. The shift doesn't come from a new insight. It comes from exhaustion of the return mechanism. You haven't understood something new. You haven't received new information. The mechanism that kept both options leveled simply no longer has the structure to keep doing that. The tilt you're sensing, or will sense in the coming hours, isn't you deciding. It's the balance point collapsing because nothing is holding it level anymore. 6 weeks of equal weight required active maintenance. The incomplete Mercury cycle gave the South Node, the pull toward the familiar, the known, the already lived, enough structural weight to keep matching the North Node's pull forward. Every time you approached a decision, the South Node had something to stand on. The incompleteness of the cycle was that ground. That ground is gone now. What that means for the next 48 hours is specific. The South Node's pull doesn't disappear, but for the first time in 6 weeks, it isn't structurally supported. The pull toward the familiar still exists, but it's pulling from a weaker position than it was this morning, and weaker still than it was 3 weeks ago. You don't need to push toward the North Node direction. You don't need to argue yourself into it or build a case for it. What you're watching for is simpler. Which option, when you sit with it quietly, begins to feel like it has more underneath it? Not more excitement, more ground. That's the asymmetry arriving, and it's the first real signal, not the last one. What comes next in this sequence gives that asymmetry a shape, a language, and finally a structure that holds. But those are two separate events, 2 days apart, and each does something different. The two events ahead don't do the same thing. Treating them as one, things resolved by the 25th, misreads both of them. They operate in sequence, and the sequence has a specific logic. March 25th, Sun conjunct Saturn at 4 degrees 43 minutes, Aries, 4:54 a.m. Eastern Time. This is the first Sun-Saturn conjunction in Aries in approximately 30 years. That matters not as a rare spectacle, but as a structural fact. Saturn in Aries is Saturn in its fall. That's an astrological term for a specific condition. It means Saturn isn't operating in its native mode here. In Capricorn or Aquarius, Saturn builds slowly, accumulates, reinforces. In Aries, Saturn doesn't accumulate. It makes direct singular contact. And when the Sun meets Saturn in Aries, it isn't a day of heavy construction. It's a synodic reset, the beginning of a new Sun-Saturn cycle, with the old one closing at the same moment the new one opens. What that means practically: whatever has been held in place by the weight of the old cycle, old commitments, old structures, old versions of a direction you were moving in before February, meets a point of release. Not forced release, structural release. Saturn in its fall in Aries doesn't reinforce what shouldn't hold, it simply stops holding it. And whatever is alive on the North Node side of this fork, whatever option has been gaining internal weight since this morning's cycle completed, meets a point of confirmation. Not emotional confirmation, structural confirmation, the kind that's still there a week later, a month later, without requiring maintenance. This is why the asymmetry you're sensing today matters. What tilts between now and March 25th is what Saturn fixes in place on the 25th, not what you decide, what's already moving. You don't need to have made a final decision before 4:54 a.m. on the 25th. You need to let what's already leaning continue leaning. Saturn will do the confirming. Your role between today and then is to not artificially level the scale back to equal, not to force the old balance out of habit, out of fear of committing, out of the 6-week reflex of returning to the middle. Then, March 26th, Venus conjunct Chiron at 25 degrees Aries, 6:44 p.m. Eastern Time. This is a different kind of event entirely, and it follows the Saturn conjunction by design. Once the 25th gives the direction structural form, once the choice that's been gaining weight receives its confirmation, Venus conjunct Chiron asks the next question. Not where are you going? What are you willing to carry there, and what are you leaving behind? Chiron in Aries touches old injuries around identity, the places where asserting a direction, choosing yourself, moving forward on your own terms, has cost something in the past. Venus conjunct Chiron doesn't reopen those injuries. It brings them into contact with the choice that just got confirmed. It asks, knowing what this direction requires of you, knowing what the other path represented and what you're releasing, what is the personal cost of this, and are you willing to meet it? That's not a second decision. It's the first honest accounting after the decision has already taken shape. The 25th gives form. The 26th gives weight to the form, personal weight, the kind that comes from understanding what the choice actually means for your life specifically, not in the abstract. Between today and the 26th, then, there are 3 distinct moments. Today, the asymmetry arrives. The 25th, one side of the fork receives structure. The 26th, you meet the full cost of what just got confirmed and find out whether it's a cost you can carry. That's the complete sequence. And the place you're in right now, today, with the tilt just beginning, is the first position in it. 3 orientations for the window between today and the 26th. Not instructions, ways of reading what's happening so you don't work against the sequence. The first, notice when one option stops feeling equal to the other. You've spent 6 weeks in a specific physical state. 2 options at the same height, the same internal weight, neither one pulling harder than the other. That state was maintained by a structure that no longer exists. What you're watching for now is not a sudden revelation. It's something quieter, a moment when you sit with the 2 paths and one of them feels like it has more underneath it, not more appeal, more ground. That's the asymmetry arriving in your body rather than your thinking. Don't test it by arguing with it. Don't immediately try to confirm it logically. Just register that it happened, that the balance point shifted without you pushing it. That moment is the signal. It means the cycle completed the way it was supposed to. The second, between today and the 25th, don't try to force a final answer. The 6-week reflex was to return to the middle. The new reflex, the one that shows up the moment that reflex ends, is often the opposite. To rush the decision, to use the open window immediately, to arrive at a conclusion while something feels different. That urgency is understandable. It's also working against what this sequence actually supports. The asymmetry that arrives today needs 2 days to become a shape. Saturn on the 25th confirms what is formed naturally. It doesn't reward what was forced into place before it arrived. Let the tilt continue without leveling it back out. That's the only active thing this window asks of you. The third, don't approach March 25th as a deadline. Saturn contacts red as pressure, as if you need to have the answer ready before the door closes. That's not what this conjunction does in this sequence. Saturn in Aries, in its fall, at the synodic reset, releases what shouldn't hold and fixes what should. You don't need to hold the right answer in place until the 25th. If it's real, Saturn confirms it without your help. If it's being held together by effort, by the weight of 6 weeks of suspension, by the pressure to finally resolve something, Saturn in its fall releases it. Quietly, without drama. You'll feel it as relief rather than loss. And then the 26th arrives. Venus conjunct Chiron. The question shifts from which direction to what it costs, personally in your actual life, not in the abstract. That's not a second decision. That's the first honest moment after the decision has already taken its shape. By then, you won't be standing at the fork anymore. You'll be one step past it, meeting what the choice actually requires of you. Between today and that moment, there is nothing to do but stay close to what you're already feeling, and stop leveling it back to equal. The third pass landed. The cycle that returned you to the same fork 6 times across 6 weeks is complete. That specific pull, back to the middle, back to equal, no longer has a next pass to make. What remains isn't clarity exactly, it's asymmetry. The 2 paths don't feel identical anymore. Something has shifted in the weight of them, even if you haven't named it yet. In 2 days, the Sun reaches Saturn at 4 degrees Aries. What became asymmetric today moves toward a shape, a concrete direction, a commitment with edges. What you're sensing now is not the final form of this. It's the tilt that comes just before. Subscribe and stay close. March 25th is the next step in this sequence, and it doesn't wait.